The Sheriff's Mistress. In the summer of 1827, George Swearingen was a hard-working, upstanding young family man. He and his lovely wife, Mary, had a new baby daughter working as a clerk and deputy to his uncle, the sheriff of Washington County, Maryland. George was being groomed to take his uncle's job. Everything was going George Swearingen's way. Then he met Rachel Cunningham in September following year. George and Rachel were fugitives running from the charge of murdering Mary Swearingen. George Swearingen had always been a hard-working public servant. At age 16, his father got him a position of clerk for the county of Washington, Maryland. Less than 2 years later, he left the job on doctor's orders, having developed a pulmonary condition due to overwork. In 1821, when George was 21 years old, he went to live with his uncle, George V. Swearingen, the sheriff of Washington County. He worked as a clerk in the sheriff's office while he studied law. In 1823, James Scott, a distant relative of Swearingen, brought his daughter Mary from Cumberland to Hagerstown to attend school. She boarded at George Swearingen's house while George was living there as well. The Scotts were a wealthy and prominent family, and at the urging of his relatives, George began courting Mary. They were soon married and in 1825 moved into a house of their own. George Swearingen finished his studies and became licensed to practice in law in Maryland, but decided instead to run for the office of sheriff. While Swearingen was preparing his campaign, his wife Mary was preparing to give birth to their first child. Due to complication with the pregnancy, Mary went to stay at her parents' house in Cumberland. Mary was away from her martial duties for at least 6 months, and George had to find other ways to meet his needs. In his words, "I occasionally visit those houses of libertism and chambering which Solomon declares to be the way to hell, leading down to the chambers of death." Rachel Cunningham had a long history as a fallen woman. She was born in Philadelphia to a wealthy physician and spent her childhood at boarding school. Rachel's mother died when she was 9 years old, and her father died when she was 14. After burying her father, there was very little money left, so she went to live with her aunt and uncle in Bedford, Pennsylvania. Rachel was a beautiful and well-informed teenager in Bedford. The men took notice. Mrs. Wallington soon found that Rachel in the house, she could fill her rooms at double the rate. Rachel as well was quickly to learn that she could trade her favors for jewelry and other lavish gifts. One boarder in particular was infatuated with Rachel Cunningham. Orlando Harvey, a wealthy young gentleman of color, fell in love with Rachel and had to possess her. Throughout the summer, they found opportunities to be together. At the end of the season, after Mr. Harvey had checked out, he returned, and at a prearranged time, Rachel climbed out her bedroom window and went into Harvey's waiting carriage. Though they did not marry, Rachel lived as Harvey's wife, and he indulged her every whim. Then one night he caught her in a amorous embrace with another young man named Mr. G. As a result, the two men fought a duel. Orlando Harvey was killed, and Rachel went to live with him. Mr. G took her to Annapolis, and against the wishes of his family, he made her mistress of the household. When his two sisters objected, he removed them from the house. As Harvey had, Mr. G gave Rachel everything she craved, but after he refused to let her fire a servant, she tried to poison him. This broke her amorous spell over Mr. G and sent her away. Rachel Cunningham had gone from a courtesan to the rich and handsome to a common prostitute who took in laundry. According to one Arthur in Hagerstown, Rachel was an ignorant, vulgar prostitute of the lowest grade with no other attraction than a very moderate share of personal beauty. But it was enough for George Swearingen, who fell madly in love with Rachel and began going to her for more than washing and mending. George took Rachel to Methodist camp meeting, and the way back he ran the buggy into a stump, wrecking the vehicle and injuring Miss Cunningham. The affair became public knowledge in the middle of his campaign for sheriff. His political associates advised George to distance himself from Rachel, but he would not. George Swearingen was a popular candidate, and in spite of the scandal, he won the three-way race for sheriff. Rachel was also affected by publicity. Her landlord threw her out. George Swearingen set her up in the house of her home and visited often. During all of this, Mrs. Mary Swearingen was in Cumberland with her parents at least as often as she was home with her husband. In September 1828, George rode to Cumberland to bring his wife back home. They were both on horseback, traveling back to Hagerstown on September 8. A drover herding cattle from Hagerstown found Swearingen sitting beside the body of his dead wife. She had fallen off her horse and died. Swearingen said there was nothing he could do. The body was taken to Kersaptown and coroner's inquisition was held. The jury viewed the body and examined the horse. The knees of the horse were cut, as if by fall. They concluded that Mary Swearingen came to her death by an act of providence. The body was buried, but Charity Johnson, one of the women who had prepared, expressed suspicion that Mary had not died in a fall from a horse. She had bruises on her throat and other bruises that suggested she was violently. Charity Johnson wanted the body disinterred and examined again. George Swearingen refused, saying he did not want his wife publicly exposed, but Mary's mother, now believed that her daughter had been killed by Rachel Cunningham, agreed to the exhumation. On this news, Rachel and George both fled Maryland, first traveling together, then separately, planning to meet in New Orleans. At the trial in September 1829, all the dirty laundry came out. The prosecution alleged that George Swearingen had tried to murder his wife twice before the actual death. First with the buggy accident on the side of the mountain, and second the day before the murder he allegedly tried to drown her while fording a river. The first was probably a legitimate accident. Swearingen was notoriously a bad driver. The second, with no witnesses, was probably pure fiction. The judge found George Swearingen guilty of murdering his wife. Before he was executed, he confessed to killing his wife Mary. Though he denied much of what was said against him in court, he admitted that he had knocked her off the horse. Mary had wanted to stop at the Telvis farm property that they owned, but George refused, knowing that at that time Rachel was staying there. When Mary persisted, it angered him, and George rode alongside, then punched her in the temple, knocking her off the horse and down a hill where she hit her head on a rock and was killed. On the gallows, George Swearingen sang a psalm and told the crowd that he wished to have it understood that he had died in peace with God and all the world. He had no doubt and no fears that his repentance would be accepted. It is not known for certain that what became of Rachel Cunningham, but a book of her life published not long after the murder says that she was tried as well and hanged for murder.